I think for many people, um, the actions of the state in the wake of the economic crisis were enlightening and useful to our purposes, to the extent that people who had many people not especially politicized, who'd grown up thinking that the centralized state, be it in Washington or Paris or London or Ottawa, was a leveler, was a democratizing influence. What they saw in the crisis, which I think ought to create a healthy skepticism toward the state, and has, is what they saw is what everybody knows now. Truckloads and truckloads of public money being used to bail out the powerful, those who had always done very well and had now run into a bit of a glitch. And I think this exposed the state for the not very neutral organization that it was, and should help people on the libertarian left in their arguments that, look, it's not just about big business. It's about this huge apparatus that acts in the interests of big business. And I think at some level people always knew this. They've always known that the government is more than anything a friend to the powerful. But I think it came out more starkly than ever could in someone's thesis or argument. It was demonstrated, with again truckloads of public money, in a way that should have, I think, beneficial effects for movements such as ours. And more important than that, I think it clears the cobwebs from a lot of people's eyes and frankly undermines, I would say, much of the liberal social democratic argument that's had sway for decades and decades, according to which, yes, it's unfortunate, the state is on the side of the powerful. Therefore, our solution to the problem, more state. An incoherent line for many years, but now illustrated, I think, for the bankrupt position it is. And I don't want to exaggerate. I mean, all people on the left have always argued, well, that state is on the side of the powerful. We need a different kind of state. I think the argument now is broader, and we can come in with the argument maybe a centralized state itself is the problem, and we have to take power back to it has to be decentralized, it has to be distributed. There can't be faith in this giant machine that ultimately is the buddy of those who are powerful.
Receptiveness to alternative organizational methods with workers. What can you say, Marc, about the experience that we have had over the last probably, is it 10 years? Anyway, 5 or more years in Toronto around organizing with workers in different groups.
Well, we have to be modest,
yes,
because we've tried a lot, and much has been unsuccessful. I mean, this is difficult stuff. We've numerous organizing campaigns began that went nowhere, or went somewhere, but then were ultimately there just wasn't the workers were afraid, or they thought it was too much effort for the risk to stand up to employers, and this is inevitably going to happen. What have been the successes, though, have been clear, that when in even small enterprises where that in a kind of global sense, or even in the sense of Toronto as a whole, don't matter that much, the lessons have nonetheless been important. That if workers stand together, if they defend each other, they can improve their conditions, whether that be a written contract, or just more money, or specific grievances or problems addressed and solved. That's happened in several cases. I don't know if this is unfortunate, but as a rule, it's been in small small places like a community center in Hamilton where IWW efforts resulted in a workers' committee inspired on IWW principles, a bike shop in Toronto, which unfortunately didn't become a citywide organizing drive of people who work in bicycle shops. It petered out. In part, it ran up against apathy and problems that couldn't be surmounted. And this couldn't be helped. In part, it didn't go any further because of the shortcomings of the individuals involved, myself included. It's not a, these. But we've learned. We do know that solidarity works. I do think though that that we have to think hard about how this method of organizing can be undertaken in larger, more substantial enterprises. How can you draw instead of 7 workers, how can you make 50 workers in a place enthusiastic about these kind of tactics of informal solidarity, if you like, where everyone stands together and everyone takes a risk, and I mean, I think simply, though the industrial workers of the world in Toronto is growing and has on paper a substantial membership, it has to attract more individuals equipped and willing to lead these kind of organizing drives. So, I mean, we shouldn't pretend that this is that this has gone further than it has, but there have been enough initiatives to indicate that it's a model that can work. So far, it's a model that works best in small enterprises. But we have to remember the IWW organized on a large scale early in the century. It's had some very large scale successes in the United States. I cited the truckers' drive that involved hundreds and hundreds of truckers. I go back to the idea that we can't predict when things will change. I suspect that we're approaching a time when there'll be a bit of a watershed, and people will, more young activists will turn to a left libertarian approach, and when those bodies and those minds are convinced and come into the movement, that's when the organizing initiatives will take off. And I think that's the way it'll be. It won't be a slow incremental chip away at the block. We will do that, but then there'll be, the dam will burst and progress will be much more. I don't like the word progress that much, but successes will be more dramatic. But this is not easy stuff. People are asked to risk their jobs and their night's sleep when they are asked to do this, and they have to. There's nothing like success to encourage this sort of commitment, but we haven't had enough success yet to make that commitment as widespread as it need be.
That said, there have been successes. I think that's important to stress, and there has been receptive workers in certain organizations, recognizably small.
There are big drives going on right now that we simply can't name.
Right.
I mean, this sounds kind of cloak and dagger, but we simply can't name because for purposes of security and so as not to undermine people.
So it could be that the scale issue is less, as Marc was saying, the successful drives in large, generally speaking, have been in relatively small organizations such as our own. So therefore the issue of scale may not be a point of blockage in terms of our imagining of what might be possible. And in principle, one could argue that although the intense micro-organizational structures of most corporate businesses are anathema to collectivization of the workers. Global kind of organizational approaches might be seen to be somewhat contradictory and wouldn't fit well with very bureaucratic corporate organizations which exist today. But we leave that one, and where there's a will, people can probably find ways of approaching them. One question, however, so let's leave it on a hopeful.
But let me say, I think in that question of, what's going on in the way of, in terms of collectivization of versus the fragmentation of labor, and how can organizing respond to this? I go back to that. I think to think about the mall is absolutely essential, where you have both going on.
Yeah.
We said you can say that this is a fragmentation. The workers aren't together. They're all working in small groups in different stores. Yet you have a bringing together of a large number of workers together in one space with various employers. But if we could get to the point where workers entertain the possibility that I'm in this together, also with the guys down there in the mobile phone stall, and with the women in the jeans store around the corner, and the ice cream guys and the cinnamon buns across the hall, that's when that realization is made, you suddenly have a collectivized workplace, and it's almost irrelevant that there are a whole bunch of different employers there, provided you can find the themes in common between
the fundamental contradiction, and it isn't a contradiction, between workers and companies, let's say, between the people who do the work in the company and the company itself as an entity, as a corporation. That fundamental, in our current environment, seems to be fundamental and elemental, you might say, elementary, is not the case. And it could be that the division between workers and the company could dissolve if you entertain the idea of a worker-run and a worker-controlled company. We work in a worker cooperative. We don't see the divisions between the business and the workers. And that is actually a concept which could be more broadly applied. Who said that there is a fundamental contradiction between the corporation and the workers who do the work in the corporation? It doesn't have to be, but it does depend on the way in which the corporation is structured. So I think there are some fundamental contradictions or apparent contradictions that the anarcho-syndicalist model of worker organization can in fact say put paid to in the garbage dump of history, let's say. Do you want to say a little bit about how workers can be, instead of opposed to the productive process, actually be in charge of the productive process?
Well, that's the thought, isn't it? That we get down to the nitty gritty. How is the alienation of the workplace solved? In the capitalist enterprise benefits from flexibility, from its capacity to make its own decisions, largely, not entirely, but largely independent of a central plan that might cripple it, say, under a system similar to that of the Soviet Union in the 1970s or something like that. But at the same time, it has nothing to say about the liberation of the individual who's trapped in the hierarchy of an enterprise in which he or she usually has little or no say, is treated as a means to a profitable end, but not as an end in him or herself, doesn't have a role, doesn't have a say. That's the claim of anarcho-syndicalism, right? That it solves these problems. It manages to get to respect both liberty and a collective work life by democratizing the enterprise. We create a company where everyone, and you can exaggerate where everyone is an equal. Do we mean that it's about sort of complete leveling in an enterprise? No, some people will work harder, some people will have an expertise that others don't. There are always talents that will, and responsibilities that will be different in a workplace. But what we insist on is a certain measure of equality and an equal voice for everyone in the management of that enterprise, and hopefully that enterprise federated with other, or federated may not be the word, relating to other enterprises in a sector, in a geographical location. But that's the claim of syndicalism anyway. That it avoids it avoids the dangers of the centralized state, and at the same time it liberates the individual by, in some significant fashion, socializing the enterprise. I think in that sense, syndicalism has always shared that assumption with Marxism, in that the bourgeoisie understood as the owning, managing class would cease to exist. Sure, I mean you're democratizing. Of course, if Joe Fairchild III, the chairman of Fairchild Industries, decides he's going to become a partner in this socialized syndicalist enterprise, he's welcome to. But I don't think that's the difference. I don't think Marx and Bakunin didn't differ on the question of what happens to the bourgeoisie. It's collectivism of two different types that they're arguing about. Marx is saying, I mean, I'm simplifying, and some Marxists will disagree, but I think history bears this out. Marx is saying the liberation of the proletariat will be achieved through centralized workers' states that plan the economy, that triumph over the chaos, anarchy, if you will, of the market through national centralized planning. Bakunin says no. The collectivized society will be one in which enterprises are run directly. They're managed by the workers themselves from below, who then freely create federations of enterprises and federations of municipalities, which freely cooperate and negotiate and make decisions that way. It's the bottom up rather than the top bottom. To simplify the argument, but I think there's no question, with the exception of the experiment in Yugoslavia, Marxism has shown no interest in worker self-management, whereas that's the heart, that's all there is to anarcho-syndicalism, which is that. Now, I think where anarcho-syndicalism is weak is where it hasn't thought through, it never thoroughly. I mean, once you have these worker-owned enterprises, how do they relate to each other? Do they relate to each other through a market? I think certainly that was implicit to some extent. Bakunin recognized, yes, the market in some form will continue, because we're talking about exchange. We're still talking about exchange of goods and services in the society, not mediated by a centralized plan. But these things are not, this is where the area is gray, and I think it has to be worked out in life. But again, but in the Marxist camp, this isn't clear either, right? I mean, the reforms in China under Deng Xiaoping were that socialism doesn't necessarily mean it means some central planning, but it means at this stage anyway, it means a vigorous market in order to. So there's no one who's dead clear on all this. But I would say only in Yugoslavia was it a genuine attempt? I guess that's a debate. But there was a real attempt to institute some form of worker self-management. It obviously didn't end up working that well.
But I think in large part there have been few attempts to implement the kinds of ideas we've been talking about.
Sure.
Deng Xiaoping, and I use this to bring our conversation to a close temporarily, Jiang Xiaoping was famous for arguing that it doesn't matter if the cat is black
Right.
or the cat is white. And I guess what anarcho-syndicalists might say is that it's important that the cat is black and white.
I think that question about organization and the state is of course central, but it's more complicated than people sometimes think. I mean, Bakunin was not, he had this original argument with Marx, and he was not an advocate of chaos or the elimination of organization. What he very explicitly made the case for were political federations built from the bottom up. That is to say, your political building block is not the Kingdom of France or the Republic of France. It's the commune. It's the municipality of Bordeaux or Paris. And that's the way that political structures are created, through the free federation of for example, municipalities from below, so that you have what you have is a radical federalism instead of a sort of sham federalism where a central state distributes certain powers to municipalities and provinces, but keeps the main powers in its hands. So it's not when I hear that it's a dispute between government and no government, I think that radically simplifies what was a more sophisticated argument, which was more about federalism versus centralization than about statelessness versus the state. That said, people like Bakunin said we're against the state, but they identified the state not with organization of any kind. They identified the state with a centralized kind of political authority.
So we're talking about kinds of state, not
maybe we are
presence or absence of state. I mean, there's always likely to be some kind of role that a supra-personal organizational form can serve.
And even in his famous sort of Catechism of a Revolutionary, or Revolutionary Catechism, he says, these municipalities, always with the right to secede, are going to assign powers to higher levels, to provinces, to regions, to something above that. So it's even there's the recognition that government, for lack of a better word, can do good things. But what is government, and and is it controlled? What are the mechanisms to make this kind of these administrative bodies? What are the mechanisms to make them servants of the population rather than masters of the population? We claim in liberal democracy that the state we've solved this, and that the state has become a servant of the people rather than its master. But I don't think anyone really believes that. That's the theory. But
it is not true. And to the extent that the role of the market has been, or this kind of market has been increased, clearly that's less and less true. What I would argue, however, to address your point, your question, Ponce, about the bourgeoisie and the proletariat, is that if one, and obviously it's a big if, but you tell me where the bourgeoisie is in our organization. Our organization is a worker cooperative, one person, one vote, and it doesn't matter, and to some extent there's a simplification, but it's true. It doesn't matter how much money you make in the organization, you only have one vote. And you only have you have as much power politically as everybody else. I think that's a fundamental issue. And there is no place for the bourgeoisie, because your money, or you don't own anything. You don't own any more than anybody else. The bourgeoisie, shall we say, as Marx said of the state, kind of evaporates at a certain point in time, and it evaporates if workers own and control the means of production.
Yeah, the tradition always said very clearly that the only justified income is income derived from work, and that leaves no role, clearly, for a class that lives off not work, but the privileges of ownership.
But the question is not some isolated group of 50 or 100
Right.
people in their enterprise where they're all equals.
Yes.
we're talking about society of millions of people where there is a bourgeoisie.
Oh, no, but there's never
there
been...
are courts, there's the police, there's a military,
Sure.
all protecting them. There are intellectuals serving at universities,
But
think
there's no
tanks, all
historical...
protecting them.
On this,
so
gr-
how
on
do
these,
you
on
battle
these
against the
questions,
bourgeoisie?
there's no... On that question, there's not been a dispute, I would say. The dispute is what you said, whether there's a role for the state later on in combating the remnants of this of this after the revolution. Do you not need a state to continue the fight against the bourgeoisie and etc. and all the machinery that it had at its fingertips beforehand? Right?
Well, at a communist stage, I believe Marx said that
Sure.
no, there wouldn't be a state.
Sure, but let's see what really happened in the history of socialism. This nice sounding, this sensible sounding approach articulated by Lenin, etc., was used by centralizing, brutalizing states to repress, to kill, to root out any kind of democratic dissent that might be raised against it. You know, after the Russian Revolution, the sailors at Kronstadt, anarchist-inspired, rise up in the interests of self-management. Trotsky says, shoot them like partridges, which is what they did. You can have an argument. You can say, oh, but we need a strong state to secure the revolution. But in 2014, we can also look back and ask ourselves, what has been the actual use of that argument? What has Marxism done with its argument for the state? Well, it's justified the massive purges and repressions of Mao Zedong in China. It's ideological window dressing for campaigns that were about the centralization of power and the elimination of all opposition. Opposition that had nothing to do, usually, with the maintenance of capitalism. Opposition which was simply criticism of a centralizing authoritarian state. So, you know, I think it's illegitimate to discuss it anymore at this time as a kind of theoretical difference between Bakunin and Marx. The context you have to have this conversation in is what has been the role since 1917 of this state, which was thought to play this instrumental role in securing the revolution, which in fact did many, many bloody, nasty, nasty things. That's the real conversation. And by the way, this is not, you know, there's a very famous Yugoslav, right, is Milovan Đilas, who was Tito's number 2, who got into trouble in the 1950s with his book, The New Class, where he argued how in Yugoslavia the revolution was being corrupted. That a new bureaucratic party privileged elite was emerging, enjoying material benefits that the rest of the society didn't have, was living as a new class, a new ruling class. And Đilas went into the slammer for this, and then remained under house arrest for a while, and then died in the 1980s. But Đilas was not the first person to make this prediction about socialist states. It was Bakunin, who in his dispute with Marx described precisely how communist states would behave once they were Mr. Marx's state. He writes it very clearly, will become a centralizing apparatus where the state not only will run politics but will run the economy, and the result will be a political entity more repressive than we've ever seen before. And you can find these writings of Bakunin from the 1860s. Long before Đilas sensed that this was coming in Yugoslavia, Bakunin knew it was going to happen, and he predicted it to the letter. So it's not just an argument about how useful the state will be after the revolution. This has to be a recognition. Marxists who want to continue to defend the role of a worker state have to first of all explain away decades of history. And if they can do that, then they can proceed to their theoretical argument.
And I suspect, I detect from Marx's tone they can't do that. I should say, in support of the argument of Bakunin and Marc from a very, very credible Marxist communist source, which is Rosa Luxemburg,
Yes.
who predicted exactly the same from within a statist point of view. She recognized, although of course she put it not as an inevitability, but as an inherent danger in the Leninist model of organizing and the Marxist, so-called Marxist.
Yes, absolutely.
So Rosa Luxemburg was there from a very early point in a very credible, from a very credible communist status, saying that if we're not very careful, this is what's going to happen.
Yeah, we have to recognize that libertarian Marxists like Luxemburg made this point, knew this and made this point. Absolutely
right.
true.
But to address, to go back to your question, Panche, the only way it would seem to me of securing the, let's call it the revolution, the change, and the preventing the return or the gradual strengthening of the bourgeoisie, even in a new environment, is for the workers themselves to do it.
That's the answer.
And they cannot rely on an intermediary organization, whether it's the state in the name of the whole, to do it for them. And the workers, if the workers are empowered, if the workers are truly realizing themselves as we believe and see that they are in worker-owned, worker-controlled, worker-owned businesses and organizations, then the workers will be what prevents the bourgeoisie returning.
Interestingly, though, before we started, you and I were talking about Yugoslavia, and it has to be said that there it didn't. And this is not something I pretend to have an answer to. That there you had structures where there were works councils or whatever they were called, the organizations of worker self-management. And what happened after or during or after the collapse of Yugoslavia is all this social property, which in theory the workers were running themselves, managed to slip into the hands of nouveau riche types, ex-bureaucrats who grabbed these enterprises. And it would be a very useful exercise, as you suggested, in finding out literally how this took place and how it wasn't resisted and why it wasn't resisted. Why it wasn't resisted might speak to the deficiencies of what Yugoslavia had in terms of worker self-management. But this is a really important question for people of our interested in these things like us. Yugoslavia must be a goldmine of information. Unfortunately, it's one that hasn't really been tapped, I don't think. The Starbucks example, remember we talked about the Charter of Amiens and the two-tiered program of Anarcho-Syndicalism. The organizing and fighting for wage gains at Starbucks is part one. Part two is you're trying to create a new society. And in that sense, the creation of the new society has much in common with the Marxist vision of what has to be done with the bourgeoisie and the state apparatus. The difference is this. The difference is this: is once the state is. I never liked this word because I think I'll say once the state is dissolved in this radical transformation, you're not reconstructing a new one. That's the difference. But I think the other part of your question is I agree with all the old revolutionaries who always maintained that these transformations have to be global. They can't be. It's not going to go anywhere if it just happens in Hamilton or in Spain or something.
In one country.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, I think the transformation has to, at the very least, has to take place in numerous centers of world capitalism, which I guess means we're talking about Europe and North America. I mean, I don't think
Panche raises questions about the inevitable hostility, let's say, of the established bourgeois apparatus of various kinds.
We saw the G20.
Right. So they ain't going to like it. And they don't. So then it's a question of tactics. And frankly, the direct assault on the apparatus of capitalism by any kind of resistant organization on the left has not been successful so far. It's likely, as I think Marx implied, is that capitalism will destroy itself, or at least it'll do the key self-destruction. What workers would do, I would argue, and this is partly because, if they've got a lot of tanks and you've got none, they're probably going to kill you before you kill them.
The scenario can't be war in the streets.
No, it can't be war. So the way you defeat capitalism, I would argue, is by making it irrelevant. And the way you make it irrelevant is by saying there is another model that works better for the people who work in it. And it isn't necessarily by giving them more, what my girlfriend would call more junk to play with. It is by fulfilling their deepest needs as human beings and as social animals as well. So if we can find a way of operating in our organizations and interpersonally in a way which fulfills better our deepest needs, then people will choose that. They won't need to be forced to do it. They will choose to do it and call it a belief. It's a well-founded belief, I would argue, that if people are given spaces in which they can in fact control their lives, they can in fact be self-managing, they can in fact be control their own destiny and dignity, then they will choose that over an option which says basically you are operatives in an industrial machine which, when push comes to shove, is more important than you are.
Yeah. We can't rule out, and this has been going on in Marxism for years, we can't rule out the revolutionary process as one of incremental change, and I think syndicalists have to embrace this too. It's not a bloody revolution today and the new society tomorrow. I think that's the least desirable and least likely of the scenarios, and maybe even should be rejected. Taodhg's talking about how the seeds of the new society are created in the old. We build up alternative networks. We build up networks of enterprises functioning in the new way. We may have, we create a model that grows and is attractive within the context of what we have now. I mean, this itself is the revolutionary process. No one can predict, I don't think, if there's some sort of decisive breaking point down the road when it goes, it qualitatively changes from this society to that society. But I think it's about examples. It's about increments. It's, as Taodhg says, it's showing to increasing numbers of workers. This is the model that fulfills your ambitions, gives you a full life. The answer, what about the army and the police? It may arise that the army and the police in their present forms, we reach a point where it simply dissolves, where it's not sustainable, and and then the city of Hamilton replaces it with a new kind of a police force. I'm not the kind of anarchist who thinks you won't need some sort of force in a city to keep order and protect people. I mean, it's not about that. But I think that's the way you've got to talk. The new model, incremental change. Look, Eurocommunism, which made its mistakes, has been talking about that from decades. How you move in a revolutionary way, but in a gradual way. Well, it kind of fell apart, and it was wrong about certain things, and it was perhaps more akin to social democracy than to what we're talking about. But it did get some things right, which I think is if you stack democratization on top of democratization, you end up with a fundamentally new society somewhere down the road, without having to go into the countryside like Mao and wage a war.
But even in the and evolution has a bit of a bad word,
Yeah.
wrongly. Even in the evolutionary model, there are leaps.
Yes, of course there are.
So it's increment, but then
Then a leap.
a jump, right? So the name, it seems to me, a couple of things. One is solidarity is catching, and I've learned this, and it is if you behave in, and it is not just because of Solidarność and my own personal interest in what happened in Poland, solidarity is catching. It is now almost inconceivable to me, although I wouldn't say I was ever a willing worker, but it's almost inconceivable to me because I lived and worked in a worker-owned organization for many years, to go back, and it is back, to an environment in which I have no power except to do what I'm told. Maybe you could say that was my personality from the beginning, but I don't think so. I mean, I've worked in factories, I've worked in kind of the most primitive, you might call it, organizations, hierarchical organizations. I won't go back there again, and it's not because of any kind of philosophical road to Damascus thing. It was just, I don't like that, you know what I mean? And I know that there are other ways of doing things.
But that's an essential point, that the however you do it, to create, if that's the right verb, the worker who won't tolerate at a certain point just being bossed around anymore.
Right.
And that's one of the things central to syndicalist initiatives is you either have a workers' cooperative or you're in a standard enterprise where you try to create a culture where, no, each and every worker counts and you're going to ask her opinion. But where you can create, that's a very good example of where the worker gets to the point, the person gets to the point where they're not going to be in a place where they're going to be bossed around anymore. No. I mean, but that doesn't mean everyone has to at some point follow instructions because instructions make sense. But that's different than being treated as a cog.
Absolutely, it's a habit that grows, and it is a habit that is shed. Finally, just to end it off, as an example of a solidarity that can exist in these kind of environments that I wouldn't say is impossible, but I think is extremely unlikely in your average capitalist organization. And I say this in a somewhat humorous way, but we have ways of joining our own organization, which will remain nameless for this video. We have ways of joining, which is basically you get asked to join, and we don't necessarily have a job for you. It's just you sound like somebody who's kind of in our spirit, so to speak.
You're talking about Toronto the Better.
Or the cooperative that operates Toronto the Better.
Yes,
so we will ask people, and I met somebody this week for whom and he was saying he was looking for a job, and I say we have no job, but you sound like the kind of person who would be appropriate for us. We'll try and find you a job. We'll try and make you a job, right? But my point around solidarity, and this will be, it'll sound a little Mary Poppins-ish, but nonetheless, we were able to do it, is that one of the workers who is no longer working with us because she moved out of town and just happened to return to town for a short period of time is short of money. And she found, I mean, I'm not saying she's starving, but she was short of money to do certain things and she isn't getting paid to January. I said, okay, we'll give you some money for the short term. And we didn't need any big, bureaucratic apparatus to say, can we do that? In fact, companies, as far as I know, companies don't give people money just because they ask for it, right? Even though they could, they won't do it. We were able to do it. Why? Because we're a collective and we have the freedom to do it, and we did it.
Well, certainly when I get fired for union organizing, I'll need them to give me a job or some money.
So
I'll be knocking on the door.
So we end on a hopeful note, and Marc will be next in line. Okay, thank you, Pancho.
Oh, good. We took up half your day, but that was very